Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join with all the other honourable members in congratulating the honourable member for Romford in bringing this bill and getting it this far. And there is a worrying sense of unanimity in the House, which always gives me cause for concern. But I'm not going to breach it, save to highlight one or two slight concerns that I have about the drafting of the bill. There's much to welcome in this bill. The chief amongst that is the immediate impact that the levelling of a fixed penalty notice has both on the individual that receives it, but also in the wider community, where there's a direct relation between cause and effect. And we all know that speed in justice is enormously important. One of the great problems that we have in society today is the delay that has bound up the criminal justice system, both particularly in the Crown Court, but also in the Magistrates' Court. I also like the direct link between the severity of the offence and the amount of the penalty notice, with the factors that are set out aggravating and mitigating in Clause 4 of the bill. But I recognise also that there's provision for the Secretary of State to give guidance as to how they should properly be applied, and that's a very important factor which needs to be taken seriously by the Secretary of State for this, I hope, legislation to be properly applied. But the reasons behind the benefit of the bill also give me some grounds for caution as we seek to apply fixed penalty notices as a mechanism for bypassing the normal course of the criminal justice system. One of the reasons the honourable member for Romford gave as to why it's so important to have fixed penalty notices is because of the delay in the Magistrates' Court. Surely, Mr. Speaker, the best way to deal with delay in criminal justice is not to bypass it by fixed penalty notices, but to adequately fund magistrates' courts and the criminal justice system that serves all of our country. There is also, under Clause 1(1), the requirement that the enforcement authority is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt. But there is no requirement under this bill to obtain or secure sufficient evidence for for them to be satisfied. And I query whether there is a risk that a prosecuting authority may see this as a shortcut to obtaining sufficient evidence to create a proper prosecution, and that fixed penalty notices may be given more readily than a decision to prosecute otherwise would be. And that would be a cause for concern for all of us if that was the case. And that leads me on to who those enforcement authorities are, because we see from Clause 1(4) that we're not told under the bill currently who the enforcement authorities are. We're told that it's going to be provided by regulation. Now, there's nothing wrong per se in secondary legislation providing further detail to the face of a bill. But in this instance, I start getting a little bit concerned, because if you look at Clause 1(5), we're told who the Secretary of State might consider as being an enforcement authority. And he says he himself, or she herself, might be the enforcement authority, fair enough, a local authority, or under 1(5)(c), any other person that the Secretary of State considers appropriate. It would be impossible to draft that clause more widely as to the definition of who an enforcement authority could be. So I very respectfully highlight this issue with the Minister on the front bench, and I would invite her to consider this, at least in her response to me, because it does give, this is the very definition of a blank cheque to the Secretary of State. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether an enforcement authority might include, for example, private prosecutors such as the RSPCA. Because if that were to be the case, then it would be running counter to the current considerations of the Law Commission, who are interested in considering the ongoing future for all kinds of private prosecutors, because we've had a recent history of significant miscarriages of justice when private prosecutors have acted. And I only have to pray and aid the biggest criminal justice scandal in our nation's history, the Horizon scandal, where the Post Office acted in the role of private prosecutor. And you can see the reasons why the Law Commission may not be keen to continue to allow private prosecutors right across our criminal justice system. And the reason why I know this was because I approached them myself in relation to the Care Quality Commission and their powers of prosecution as a private prosecutor in the health sector because of an absolute scandal in my constituency at Causton Park Hospital, where 3 patients with mental health and autism, as well as Down syndrome, died over a 27-month period because of neglect and, certainly in one case, physical abuse. So I raised the very serious concern about whether private prosecutors could amount to an enforcement authority under Clause 1.4. And then, finally, Mr. Speaker, I move to Clause 5.2, which sets out the ability for enforcement authorities, when they apply a fine, which can be up to £5,000, they can deduct, most of that money will return to the central funds, but it gives them the ability to deduct their own costs of prosecution from any fines created. That is a clear financial incentive to issue fixed penalty notices because it pays for their own operations. And I hope that all of us will be naturally concerned to ensure that we don't have a parking fine company approach applied to this area of law. That would be wholly not what the Honourable Member for Romford would be intending, or any of the rest of us. So it is very important that the Secretary of State, when coming to secondary legislation in this matter, by the regulation, really thinks hard about that potentially poisonous mix between a financial incentive and private prosecution. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I again thank the Honourable Member for Romford for getting behind this legislation, bringing it to the House, and I hope to a happy conclusion. But I do ask the Minister to think carefully about potential unintended consequences, because we've heard about Staffordshire Bull Terriers, we've heard about Spike and Buster, but let's not forget that we need to look after John Bull as well. As he is persecuted by the heavy hand of the state, we want to give him also protection, and we need to make sure that our legislation is well drafted.